Hi, everybody. I am very happy to have the opportunity today to introduce the tech talk of Sarah Berry, visiting researcher at Google and assistant professor at MIT CSAIL. Welcome back to the TinyML talks. I'm looking forward to a great session where Sarah will tell more about efficient AI. And please interact with us as much as you can. On top, you see that there is the chat, the Q&A. So input your contribution there because we would like to have your views, comments, and interact with you as much as we can. And I think Sarah will be happy also to reply to your questions, to your comments, and see your feedbacks. But before to leave the floor to Sarah, I need to thank the TinyML strategic partners, which are committed to take TinyML at the next level. And actually, they are the full of the TinyML community, and in particular AIZ, Panel of Device, Aeon Devices, Arduino, ARM, DeepLight, Gimpulse, PhotoHub, Greenway Technologies, Groverty, IBM, ImageBob, Innatera, Ethermis, apologize if I'm wrong in some pronunciation, Clickattech, Microsoft, Nota AI, NXP, OptoML, Pauling Technology, Prophecy, Quixo, Qualcomm, Rixen, Renesas, SAP, Schneider Electric, Sensimil, Silicon Labs, Sony Semiconductor, ST Microelectronics, Stream Analyze, Synaptics, Cynthian, and TDK in the sense. It's important that you are active part of the TinyML community, so don't miss the opportunity to join our meetup. And also be part of our LinkedIn community. So don't be afraid and contribute with posts, with comments, with feedbacks. Really, we are eager to see your contribution in order to have even more vibrant community. And on the TinyML YouTube channel, you will find lots of contributions, tech talk, demonstrations. There is a huge amount of material you can learn from, and I'm sure by searching you will find what fits your needs. So don't miss the opportunity to take advantages of those resources, which are for free and available to all the machine learning practitioners and interested people. Huge event is going to happen. It is the yearly flagship event of the TinyML community, is the TinyML Summit. Essentially, it is composed by two parts. The research symposium, which will happen on March 27 in San Francisco, close to the airport at the Hyatt Regency, followed by the 28th and 29th of March exhibition and summit. It's important you join us. As I said, this is the important, most important event is happening in US, in the Bay Area. Registration are open, so take advantage of the registration. And also, please contribute in terms of nomination, best product of the year, best innovation of the year, best paper. We are looking to see your contributions, and most importantly, attend in person. Next, after the TinyML Summit, another very important event is going to happen in Amsterdam, in Europe, and will take place between June 26 and June 28. Last year was in Cyprus. It was a great event, really rich of contributions, also formats. The TPC added a lot of new content and way to present TinyML subjects. So we plan to be also into the Netherlands events, and there is a call for presentation which is open. So please send your abstract by the end of February 28th. and you will be notified about the acceptance and hopefully, and then plan to join in person because you will meet in person a lot of people and to make even more interactive the contribution. Then another quite important event is the Embedded World, where lots of embedded practitioners, developers meet between March 14th and 16th this year in Nuremberg. This is one important event for the embedded community. TinyML will be there, recognizing the importance to interact with all the people. So also join us there. There will be the pavilion and the exhibition, and there will be technical sessions at the conference chaired by Professor Daniel Muller, Technical University of Munich. And now a few words about Sarah Biri before leaving her the floor and looking for her very interesting talk, tech talk. Sarah is currently a visiting researcher at Google, where she works on automating urban forest monitoring, and will join MIT as an assistant professor in the Faculty of AI and Decision Making in September 2023. So very warm congratulations to Sarah for this big achievement. Biri received her PhD in computing and mathematical science from Caltech, where she was advised by Pietro Perona and awarded the Amori Doctoral Prize for her fields. Her research focuses on building computer vision methods that enable global scale environmental and biodiversity monitoring. She partners with non-governmental organizations and government agencies to deploy her method in the wild worldwide, and works toward increasing the diversity and accessibility of academic research in AI through interdisciplinary capacity building and education. So welcome, Sarah, and the floor is yours, Sarah. Have a great talk.
Thank you so much, Danilo. Yeah, so thank you for having me. I'm really excited to interact with and speak with this community because as I'm going to hopefully motivate with this talk, I think that there is so much that specifically the TinyML and sort of the embedded and efficient and edge-based AI communities can do in the pursuit of better understanding of things like biodiversity loss globally. And so, you know, why do I care so much about biodiversity? Unfortunately, we're currently facing what's being called the 6th mass extinction. We're actually losing species at a faster rate now across the taxonomic tree than we were during the last extinction of the dinosaurs. And, you know, this isn't just sort of tragic because the natural world is amazing and beautiful, and you know we want to be able to still appreciate it and appreciate the breadth and the diversity of all these different ecosystems worldwide. Biodiversity is also very intrinsically tied to a bunch of aspects of our global ecosystem that really affect us as a human population. So biodiversity is intrinsically tied to climate change, and actually in both directions. There was a great paper that came out recently from actually another professor at MIT exploring the effect of elephant populations on carbon sequestration across the African continent. Biodiversity is also intrinsically tied to public health. As we see reductions in habitat of species, we start to see isolation of subgroups or subpopulations of a given species, which leads to decreased genetic diversity. And then we also start to see more interaction at those boundaries, because wildlife are sort of being forced into smaller and smaller areas. They end up interacting more with urban populations. And then this leads to the possible spread of zoonotic diseases. You know, I think we've all learned in the last few years how much of an impact that can have. And then also food security. Not only does the decrease in pollinators potentially lead to many issues with global scale agriculture, we've also started to see some interesting research that's showing that diversity of pollinators actually leads to more nutrition in our food. And beyond that, biodiversity is tied to things like ecosystem services, not just carbon sequestration, but soil stability. The list goes on and on. So hopefully, I think, at least I am very convinced that biodiversity is something that we need to better understand. And really, I would love to move with my own work towards not just understanding how and the largest factors of biodiversity loss at large scale, but actually moving towards mitigation, taking concrete action to try to reduce that loss. And I'm not the only person who thinks that this is important. Biologists, ecologists, zoologists have been studying biodiversity for hundreds of years, but really, the advancement in sensor technology and in hardware has really led to an explosion of data that's being collected to try to help understand biodiversity and biodiversity loss. That's, now we use to study biodiversity everything from satellite images, low-flying aircraft like drones, or that are collecting multimodal and multi-sensor data on animal sensors, so sensors that are very small, that are actually put in collars and tracking the behavior of individual animals over time. And then stationary sensors, networks of camera traps, bioacoustics, sonar, sensors that are placed in remote areas and are constantly collecting data. And then we're moving more and more also towards data collection through community science. So platforms like iNaturalist, for example, enable just passionate community members worldwide to go out, collect images of plants, animals, bugs, and then through the community, identify the species and translate that into species observation data in the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. But unfortunately, that all of this data collection, though it really speaks to the potential that we're currently at to really get much broader scale information, the classical paradigm for ecological or biodiversity research has kind of started to fall apart as we're seeing more data being collected. So classically, an ecologist might put out some sensors, collect data, bring that data back to their lab, manually process all of it. So go through and identify what's seen, anything important to their research questions, and then bring that in and dig into maybe like ecological modeling to try to figure out something like the distribution of species in an area or the density of species in an area. But so I have a network of camera traps in Kenya, and last year it collected 10 million images. And so now at this scale, it's completely unreasonable to try to process that data manually. Even if you had an army of undergraduates, it becomes very, very difficult. Community scientists have now actually collected, this number is now doubled. It's over 120 million species observations through the iNaturalist platform I mentioned. And aerial surveys can generate sometimes up to 200 terabytes of video just from a single flight. And then if you're talking about the sort of the current elephant census that's been being done across Tanzania and Kenya, where they're flying the entirety of both countries, that rapidly becomes just vastly overwhelming. So we really need computer vision and different types of AI to automate data processing in these spaces. But it's quite tricky. So first, biodiversity data is very noisy. Often we don't sort of have a lot of the things that you might have in sort of like images captured by a human, where the object of interest is centered and well lit and taking up most of the frame. With these sort of automatic sensors that I'm sure the folks in the TinyML community are more familiar with, at least some of them, you end up with things like this giraffe hiding behind the tree, or these impala down here that are very poorly lit. And then you'll also end up with a lot of data, lots and lots of data that's empty. Sometimes 70, 80, 90% of the data from a static sensor could be empty. But empty according to who? And one of the things that we've been thinking about is actually how do we capture more information out of the data we've collected? Because maybe there's no animals in these pictures, but what you are getting is this incredible, very high resolution longitudinal picture of a microhabitat and how that interacts with environmental covariates. But we really need to be able to automate the processing of that to be able to extract that information in a useful way. Biodiversity data also has a very long tail. And this is something that I think is explicitly complex when you're talking about moving to more and more efficient models. Because not only could you do sometimes have, something like 10,000 way classification that you're trying to do, actually, this is just looking at the first 16 million observations in iNaturalist. But if you assume you need about 100 training examples for a given category, there's about 10,000 species in that set that have enough data to be learned by some sort of common machine learning model. Then you have this order of magnitude more species that are below that threshold. And so when we're working with biodiversity data, we often really can't ignore that few shot problem. And actually, from an ecological perspective, sometimes the anomalies, the rare stuff, the endangered species are the ones that are most important to categorize correctly. So there's kind of this interesting trade-off in terms of what we expect machine learning models to do well and what we need them to do in order to really capture the information we want from these data streams. And finally, and maybe most challengingly, biodiversity data is just intrinsically not independently and identically distributed. And that's a base assumption for many of our sort of modern machine learning methods. So here, this is just looking at data access. So if you look at a map of alpha diversity, just the number of unique species that exist worldwide on the left, you can see it's really concentrated in the subequatorial tropics. But if you look at actually where we have species data in that sort of largest curated database, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, you'll notice that that's really biased towards the US, to Europe, Australia, maybe South Africa. But they're almost anti-correlated. So we need to be able to handle this type of domain shift, but also species themselves are migrating, are moving, and with climate change, we're seeing where species thrive shift every year. And so even if you were able to perfectly capture the distribution of species today, next year that distribution would have changed. And so this really means that we have to think about building methods that are robust and adaptive to things like domain shift and distribution shift in the real world. So I'm going to first talk a bit about static cameras. That's something I work with quite a bit. So this is just looking at Wildlife Insights, which is a global scale data repository and data management platform. That's a partnership between Google and about 30 different NGOs. And I work on the AI team for Wildlife Insights through my work at Google. And this is just sort of the distribution of the 22 million camera trap records in Wildlife Insights. And so, as an example of some of the things, like some of the projects that this type of platform supports, one of the things is this Australian brushfire recovery project, where they've collected over 1 million images across Australia, and they're actually trying to study the how species are coming back after those terrible wildfires that happened in 2020. But one of the things that makes this hard from a machine learning perspective, if you want to build models that are able to automatically identify species in camera traps, is that you have pretty major distribution shift between sensors. So not only do you have sort of a distinctive background per sensor, so there's this visual shift between one sensor and another, even in the exact same sort of region of the world, you'll also have subpopulation shift. So that's like the distribution over the species set for one sensor can be quite different from another, even if they're nearby. And part of that is actually the habits of animals. So for example, we have a camera trap in the greater Los Angeles area where 90% of the images at that trap are bobcats. Because there's a bobcat den right next to the camera trap. So they're constantly walking by. But actually that's pretty major shift from sort of the underlying distribution, or the underlying prior that you learn if you sort of learn that data in aggregate, which is that bobcats are quite rare. So what you can imagine here is that it's actually important in a way to try to understand a per sensor prior or per sensor distribution to be able to better identify what you see. And then also what you end up with is that for one of these given sensors, the data can be very repetitive. So there's like very low sample efficiency, which means it's almost like you can memorize what's going on at a given sensor. And that's actually very useful. But the problem is you can start to memorize it and then start to ignore anomalies. And it means that, unfortunately, when you train models on a set of sensors and then try to use them on new sensors that weren't seen during training, you often see a major degradation of performance, even if you're in a case where that new sensor is actually maybe even in the same place, but just shifted to look at a slightly different background. And this type of performance drop due to distribution shift is very ubiquitous in real world scenarios. This was a work that we did to try to build a benchmark across application domains of the effects of distribution shifts. And we really found that across the board, these types of real world distribution shifts are still causing huge problems for modern machine learning methods. So how do we close the gap for static sensors? So one of the things that we've found is that you can actually pretty significantly reduce the impact of that generalization gap in performance by both moving to like a localization versus classification scenario. So here we're using YOLO v5, this model we've trained called the mega detector, which just detects humans, animals, and vehicles in camera traps. And that model generalizes quite well. So some of that is you're reducing kind of that foreground background localization challenge by giving the model information about what you see. But the other, and I think more important aspect, is that you've reduced the level of granularity at which you need to predict, which then actually enables you to kind of learn an aggregate representation of animals, for example, that is able to capture new species that maybe haven't already been seen by the model. But also, I think this kind of gets at, what can be done reliably now, and then maybe what's kind of the open questions for research in the future. And I think we can reliably detect animals in these types of static sensors and even do it quite efficiently. But it is much less possible to categorize to the fine-grained species level in a reliable way. And so this megadetector model is currently used to process data for over 50 NGOs, conservation organizations globally, everything from, wolf population management to detecting potential poaching threats. But I think one of the things that's a big challenge here is in many of these cases now, because you can potentially filter out empty images, you really could start moving towards a system, a participatory system, where humans were able to really direct their attention to maybe the more challenging things, the less common species. But now we've run into this big bottleneck in terms of data movement. So, a single camera could collect up to 700,000 high resolution images per month. This is just this distribution of cameras that we've put out in Kenya. And what we found is that, okay, yes, we have machine learning models that can process this data, but moving the data from a remote research camp in Kenya to the cloud when it's about 700,000 high resolution images becomes a big issue. So we end up actually putting this data on hard drives, flying it to the US and uploading it there, because even when we move the data to Nairobi, we still see bandwidth issues that make this very, very difficult to keep up with. And so really what a lot of people who work on these types of static imaging sensors are moving towards is trying to reduce some of that bottleneck around data movement, trying to think more carefully about sort of allocation of resources. How do we actually move towards cameras that are doing as much of the processing as possible on the edge, and then sending only the data that is potentially relevant or useful or interesting to the ecological researcher? These are just a few examples of commercial edge-based AI camera traps that are actively in development. So ZSL is working on what they're calling Instant Detect, which actually does metal detection and is focused on anti-poaching. There's this TrailGuard AI camera, which tries to mitigate anti-poaching and human-wildlife conflict. And then Conservation X Labs is working on a device that you can actually connect to any commercial camera trap that's focused on real-time animal behavior monitoring. And I think in all of these cases, some of the big open challenges are really around that reliability and robustness. If you've trained your model on some cameras, now you want to use it on others, what can you reliably process on the edge? What do you need to choose to save, to store, to send back to maybe a central location to be able to really ensure that you're not missing rare species, missing out on very important but maybe difficult to predict from an AI perspective events, but trying to reduce that huge onus and overhead of moving around millions of images. And sort of along these lines, Edge Impulse, which I know is one of the supporters of TinyML, has been partnering with wildlabs.net, and they actually have an On the Edge Wild Labs Fellowship that's focused explicitly on some of these questions. How do we move some of the processing to the edge in camera traps so that we can actually get closer to real-time processing, and really help to sort of really make best use of the bandwidth that we do have in these really remote areas. So beyond camera traps, there's lots of other things that we might want to understand. One here is one example is a system that we've developed that tries to do individual elephant identification. So if you thought that, you know, species level prediction is something that's actually quite fine-grained and can be difficult to do in practice, now if you move beyond that to actually identifying individuals in a population, particularly large populations, like in South Africa and Kruger National Park, there's 35,000 individual elephants. You want to be able to robustly identify each of those individuals. And what we found is that you can do this reasonably reliably for individuals that you've seen multiple times. So if you've seen an individual 5 or 6 times, you can train a model that's pretty good at clustering the representations of that individual together. Here, these representations are a combination of sort of contrastively learned features of specifically ears and faces, as well as actually extracted contours of the ears and some wavelet-based matching. But then for individuals that you haven't seen very many times before, what you really need is that human participation, because humans are much better at re-identifying. Individuals are doing that matching in these low shot scenarios. So what we've built is this human AI system where actually for new individuals that are sighted, humans build in these codes for each individual elephant. These were developed by pachydermists in South Africa. And then we combine those with our AI systems. And we try to basically trade off between the human effort involved and sort of the efficiency of the system to try to get to identifying individuals as quickly as possible. And, you know, we basically, like I said, are combining like this really explicit coding attribute labeling with vision-based methods to try to build a robust database with non-experts, so people who are not experts identifying individuals, and experts in the loop. And one of the things that now we're realizing is that what we really need is something that can do this on the edge. And now as you're moving into these spaces where the granularity of the problem is even broader than what we talked about for the camera traps, being able to move this to sort of an edge-based, maybe on a phone or on an iPad platform so that field researchers can easily match the individuals they see in the field into the growing sort of database of individuals is really an open challenge. And we have already started doing this with this sort of attribute-based system alone. But I think moving towards figuring out how to make this complex ensemble of 3 different methods from the computer vision side, make that more efficient and more edge-based really would help with elephants, but also with many, many different populations where they're at risk, they're endangered, and we want to understand the population size and how that's changing over time. So we need to be able to identify individuals of the species. And finally, I wanted to talk about another sort of need for edge-based processing, where we're looking at maintaining sustainable fisheries with static sonar. So here, this is a project I've been doing with researchers from Caltech for quite a while. And we're working with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and the Departments of Fish and Game of Washington, Oregon, California, and NOAA to try to be able to better monitor the escapement of fish as they go upstream so that they can make almost real-time decisions every 4 hours about whether to open and close the $4 billion industry in the Bristol Bay. And Kenai, you know, the fisheries beyond that as well. So this is the deployment of these static sonar. They're sort of deployed pretty comprehensively across the US and Canada West Coast. And what these do is they basically are using sonar as opposed to something like RGB imaging because of, you know, glacial runoff, turbulence, storms. You end up with really low visibility in these rivers. But you need to be able to make sure that enough fish have gone upstream to spawn that in 3 years, when those new babies go out to sea and then come back, you still have enough of a population to maintain a sustainable fishery. And currently the way this is done is you actually have teams of scientists that will go live in a tent in the field site at the location of these sonar. And they take 4-hour shifts round the clock, and they sit and they watch these streams, and they have a counter for upstream and a counter for downstream. And they're actively just counting the number of fish that go upstream minus the number of fish that go downstream. They radio those counts in because they don't have the bandwidth in the field for even something like satellite connection always. So they'll use actually like shortwave radios to radio those into their local office. And then those local offices are then making these almost real-time decisions about whether the fishery is open and closed for commercial fishing. So currently what we've been exploring is using a detect to track pipeline. So first we detect potential fish, then we associate tracks. And then we use the same heuristics that the scientists use to determine whether a given track should count as an upstream or downstream or neither. But again, we see quite a few challenges. So with this type of data, you both have, massive differences in the range of the sensor. You'll have a lot of background texture that can change over time. You'll see these what are called sonar shadows. So if a fish is in front and then there's one behind, it can be blocked by the background, like the reflectance of the fish off the front, so you won't see the one behind. You have large amounts of sediment. And then the target density will change a lot. During the shoulder areas, you might see only a few fish. In the middle of the salmon runs on the Kenai River, for example, you're getting sometimes 1 million fish in a week. And what we found is that you can actually do a reasonable job on rivers that you've trained on by incorporating some classic methods for change detection, things like optical flow. But these are quite computationally expensive, and so they really slow down the speed of processing. And what we need is near real-time counts from these remote field sites, but we also really need them to happen on device because we cannot send the volume of video and the volume of data to the cloud, given the bandwidth constraints we have, in enough time to actually get these counts back to the fisheries. And so really this requires edge-based models that are robust and reliable as these environmental conditions change, that are able to sort of adapt throughout the season to these changes in density, these changes in turbulence, these changes in, for example, background reflectance as plants grow or die. And what we've really found is that efficient generalizable detection is the main bottleneck in our current method. So the tracking, assuming detection is good, the tracking actually does quite well. But what we do find is that as these sensors change, or as you move to a new river that hasn't been seen during training, we start to see, again, degradation in performance because we're again talking about distribution shift. And so really it kind of comes back around again to like some of the big open challenges that we face being reliable adaptation or handling of distribution shift, particularly as you move to these efficient and edge-based models. And last, I wanted to talk a bit more about iNaturalist, just because I think this is such a cool example. So iNaturalist is this large platform where people will record observations. A community of fellow naturalists helps to identify them. And then these actually can be contributed as research-grade observations to GBIF. There's currently over 120 million species observations in iNaturalist worldwide. It's an incredibly comprehensive data set, but of course there's still biases in this data because it's innately tied to where humans go. These are observations collected by humans, which means they are going to be biased towards locations that are easily accessible. And actually biased towards things people like to take pictures of. So I know myself, I use this all the time, but I'm much more likely to take a picture of a cool bug or a pretty flower than I am to take a picture of like, I don't know, some sort of grass. But actually one of the really cool examples, this is work by a friend of mine named Grant Van Horn, is they've actually looked at moving 10,000 way common species classification. So just really focusing on the species you're most likely to see day to day to the device, so to the actual edge device. And so if you haven't tried this, I highly recommend it, but the Seek app essentially runs on your device offline. You can take it hiking with you, and it'll actively kind of AR, VR, it runs a model in real time and will walk down the taxonomic tree to the level that it's confident enough to give you a prediction. So it's kind of like Pokemon Go, but for the real world, and you can connect this to committing these observations actually into these research grade GBIF species observations. And part of what made this possible is actually a pretty clever trick where that final layer of the model, which was, you know, an incredibly dense up to 10,000 way classification, they actually embedded the taxonomic tree into the outputs. So they were actually able to massively compress that output. So now you just predict actually an encoding, and then that encoding can be mapped back into the actual sort of full classification. Awesome. And I think along those lines with iNaturalist, another one of these things that we would love to move towards, which is again, talking about efficiency. Now here it's more data efficiency. How do we efficiently ask or answer new ecological questions? So going beyond species identification, how do you make it very easy for an ecologist or a biologist to come in and say, okay, can you show me in the 120 million observations in iNaturalist, all of the examples of juvenile gulls? Can you show me all of the examples of here, for one instance, alligator lizards mating? Can you show me any examples of animals that have scabies in the wild? To be able to really move into the space of extracting new information from data that's already been collected and be able to really scale up and answer new research questions. And again, this takes the ability to really very efficiently be trained on a new task and build representations that are easily adaptive to new ecologically relevant tasks. And so, you know, finally, I think, particularly as we're talking about EdgeML, I think that clearly there's a ton of need in this space. But I also think on the flip side that as we make these models more efficient, we actually move to a space where they're more equitable. Because what we find is that, you know, with partners, you know, on the ground in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, they don't have access to huge clusters to train models on, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of examples. They don't have access to like the sort of bandwidth they need to move that scale of data around. As we make these models more efficient in terms of both sort of computational use, but also in terms of efficiency of training and reliability and robustness of training, and as we better understand what the models can be trusted to do and what we should actually incorporate human expertise on, that really moves us to a space where we're no longer sort of forced to do what can be sometimes termed parachute science, which is basically like, I will come collect data from a given area on a given problem, bring that back to a wealthy institution like, for example, Caltech or MIT, do a lot of research or process that data, and then not actually have what we learn be accessible back to that community. And so I really think that we need both access to knowledge and tools to be expanded sort of globally, but also the more that we make these models efficient, the more that we make them less reliant on massive scale compute, the more accessible and equitable they're going to be. And kind of along those lines, I've been thinking a lot about capacity building, particularly in applied computer vision. And so we've been running this summer school. We're about to make the sort of final acceptance decisions for the second session of it, where we're trying to train people from NGOs, PhDs in ecology, postdocs in actually practically building computer vision solutions for their own ecological and environmental research questions. So it's a 3-week program that we run. We work with them to sort of curate prototyping data sets ahead of time. They come to Caltech and they really are writing all of their own code and training their own models. But again, in this space, so much of our choices is kind of based around what resources they're likely to have in their own institutions going forward. And so we really push towards more efficient models and more data efficiency because we know that that's necessary. Awesome, thank you so much. If you are interested in jumping in and learning more about some of the work that's going on in AI for conservation, we have a Slack channel. And if you're interested in joining, you just email aiforconservation@gmail.com. There's over 1,000 researchers worldwide in that community working on these types of problems. And yeah, I'd be really happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It was a great talk and very informative. I think we have a lot of questions in the Q&A chat box. I suggest you to start having a look at them, and we have 10, 15 minutes maximum to address the question.
Cool. So should I look, there's the webinar chat, and then there's also maybe a Q&A, or also I'm happy if you want to kind of facilitate and just the specific
I
questions.
can facilitate. Yeah, the first question is, could you please explain the acoustic sensors again before going further? Maybe it was during your presentation. But yeah, the question is, explain more the acoustic sensor.
So I think you're talking about the sonar that I mentioned. There's also a lot of work on sort of other types of bioacoustic sensors. For example, sensors that can be placed in these static networks in forests to study maybe elephants or birds, other loud species, gibbons. But specifically, the sensors we've been looking at are static sonar, and basically it's active sonar. So they send out pulses, and then they get back sonar reflectance. And they have sort of different capacity in terms of the type of coverage you want to look at. So you can change sort of the beam width and the pulse frequency on these devices and sort of your lens to be able to try to capture either like near shore or farther away from shore. And I think they can go up to about 70 meters. But as you go into that very far shore range, the fish themselves get very, very small. So it can be a bit of a trade-off in terms of how reliable or how easy it is to work with that data for a human or for a machine learning model. Do you have any other clarifying questions?
Yes, there are. The next is a question also I have in my mind. How does event-based vision, in your perspective, will contribute to the wildlife conservation?
Sorry, can you say it again?
How does event-based vision, in your perspective, will contribute to the wildlife conservation?
Yeah, I mean, I think event-based vision is such an interesting and cool idea. One of the things that I've thought about specifically with event-based vision is that, you know, right now for these static camera sensors, just as one example, it'll often have sort of a motion trigger, and that motion trigger can be sometimes triggered by waving grass or moving trees or changes in lighting. And that's one of the reasons we end up with so many empty images. And so one of the things I think could be quite cool is actually if you're moving towards event-based vision, you could do a better job of incorporating sort of in a very efficient way the types of motion you're seeing and then capture those RGB images only as needed. So you're doing a better job of maybe more efficiently making decisions on when, you know, you should capture that imagery and trying to save battery life, trying to keep those sensors out for longer without needing a human to go visit them. So that's just one thing, but I think there's tons of different opportunities for just moving to these different kind of interesting ways to capture information in the field.
Yeah, I wonder also if these could be another opportunity to be triggering learning after an event, because you said biodiversity is huge, communication is limited, and there is a long tail of information, and there are unpredictable conditions in different ways, weather or the landscape and so on. So what's your thought on learning, continuous learning, and applying learning after events?
Yeah, no, I think that that's really the way we need to go, particularly for these static sensors, because essentially there's so much spatiotemporal context that's there. And I really think we need to be moving to more of a system where each individual sensor can adapt on the fly as the conditions change, adapt to the subpopulation distribution that they're seeing. But then I think the challenge there is you really need to kind of have the right trade-off between this adaptation and anomaly detection, because kind of the more you sort of focus in on what you're likely or frequently seeing, I think the more risk you have that you might, for example, miss or mispredict that one example of a very rare species showing up in a place that it's never been before, which is a very important sort of ecological sighting. So I think it's kind of this cool trade-off between adaptation, anomaly detection, and also quality control. You know, how do we decide what data to send to a human to kind of make sure that that adaptation is not actually causing some sort of model drift, that we're maintaining the reliability of the system. Oh, and I just saw the follow-up question about the sensors. So those acoustic sensors are from a company called ARIS. They used to be sort of DIDSEN sensors. Now they're ARIS, ARIS. Those are the most commonly used ones by these different departments of Fish and Game.
Okay. Another question is, what is the role of uncertainty in machine learning object detection in forestry, and how is the relative to high-speed robotics?
In forestry. I mean, there's a lot of different ways people are trying to use computer vision in forestry. I would not claim that I'm an expert in all of them. I've been looking at multimodal forest monitoring. So how do we kind of incorporate information from, you know, satellite imagery, which is maybe much more temporally available, but super low resolution, when it's available, but much sparser, sort of higher resolution aerial data coming from like EOS or different like low flying aircraft platforms, and then ground level information. So in this case, for example, we're using Street View. And looking at kind of the value of that data to doing something like tree species classification versus the accessibility or scale of that data. But I think generally, when I think about uncertainty, so I think that we're not ever, if we're being honest, going to get to models that are perfect. We're never going to sort of build these systems where the machine learning model is in fact perfect. And so I think for us, uncertainty needs to capture both maybe the model uncertainty, but also the risks of errors as determined by the end user. So here, one example would be, again, in the camera trap space, we have different users using these detection models for wildlife, but they end up actually using them in very different ways. So if you're working on detecting invasive species, like invasive rodents on islands, it is incredibly important that you do not miss a single rodent, because one that you miss could devastate the local bird population in a matter of weeks. So in those cases, you know, when you think about uncertainty, particularly because often you've never seen a rodent at one of these sensors, you really have to actually be quite careful about, you can't make guarantees. And when you're trying to maybe estimate the uncertainty of a system in a location where you've never seen the thing you might care about, that can be very, very difficult to do sort of in a principled way. But so what we end up building up is sort of systems where the users themselves can interact with the model, interact with sort of its predictions, and try to probe those in a way where they then determine what thresholds they want to use, that trade-off between human effort and what the model can filter for them. And try to really move that into the space of the user, because they better understand the risks. And when we're talking about forestry, for example, one thing people are very interested in is like verification of carbon offsets. There, I think understanding some of these like generalization gaps, you know, some of these kind of degradations in performance that you might expect to see as things change over time or over space, and trying to really figure out how to measure uncertainty in a new place where maybe you haven't got ground level training data that's very expensive. I think that's a big open question, and I think that uncertainty will play a very big role in those spaces.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Thanks, Sarah, for sharing this good information. Nelson said very nice talk already, and he was wondering the motivation behind this positioning of the camera installation. How certain are you that it's capturing the animal representation of the region?
Yeah, so again, this is, you know, every individual user has their own questions of interest, and people actually place their cameras relative to what they want to capture. So if you're really interested in small mammals, you're likely to place your cameras much closer to the ground, and you'll actually try to strategically place them in a way that, like, potentially, if there's kind of a common use trail, that it's going to capture that from close quarters. If you're interested in elephants and giraffe, large scale mammals, you're going to place your cameras much higher on the trees. There's sometimes arboreal camera traps, so cameras that are actually placed directly in the tree canopy to try to capture tree canopy biodiversity. What you will end up doing is your camera placement will bias what animals you're likely to capture with those motion triggers. And I actually think that a lot of the commercial cameras, they're originally developed by the kind of hunting industry, and then they started to get used by the ecological community because they were cheap, robust, accessible. But their motion triggers are really optimized for deer in many cases. So actually, they're really not very good necessarily at detecting smaller mammals, things like reptiles that are cold-blooded and less likely to trigger sort of maybe an IR-based sensor. So I think that there's actually a lot of potential moving towards sort of that hardware-software co-design, trying to optimize for broader collection of data across the taxonomic tree for a given sensor.
And also, thank you. And also, Nelson, as a second question, what also your take on using AI for predicting impact of extractive industry, like in the oil-rich landscape of Uganda, on wildlife conservation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the big desires for the ability to kind of have more like higher temporal and higher spatial resolution of monitoring of wildlife is to better understand like management choices, but also the impacts of potentially something like a growing urban area near what had previously been an undisturbed landscape, or something like extractive industries. So, I mean, I think if we move towards better wildlife monitoring in general, then it will enable us to try to better understand all of these impacts and maybe sort of allocate resources to try to mitigate them. I think that it's often quite complex. And I think that, you know, computer scientists, one of the things that we really need to think about when we're building like AI systems for monitoring is making sure that the systems we build are not potentially putting sort of people at risk. So with, for example, if people are using machine learning to look at anti-poaching, like what does it mean if you catch a poacher? What are sort of the ethical considerations of like, you know, automating essentially like policing in, you know, in different areas. And I think that it's important for us to understand that we are not the experts and we are not God, and we should not be making those decisions. And so you really want to collaborate with people, both sort of users on the ground to understand the implications of the models that you build, but also, you know, ethicists, policymakers. You know, we can't build these systems in a vacuum. And I think that's a lesson that we're learning across the board in AI, not just in wildlife conservation, that we can't build these systems in a vacuum. We can't sort of treat AI as if it's almost agnostic to ethical considerations.
Thanks, Sarah. We are very close to running out of time, but maybe let me just pick up another two questions for quick answers, hopefully. One that I think is very interesting is, what do you think about continuous learning? Algorithm deploy on the edge device. You said about online detections, and what are the challenges and accuracy if this is something you maybe already explored or you are aware of?
Yeah, so one of the things we've kind of been looking at recently is how to basically do almost like fine tuning of models in a really efficient way for individual sensors, particularly for the sort of sonar deployments, but we've also looked at the same thing for camera traps. Basically, in what ways do you want to let a model overfit to a specific sensor? And in what ways do you want to push back against that overfitting? Because, like I said before, it's potentially preventing you from detecting rare things that might be very important. And yeah, I stand by my point before, which is that I think it's kind of the big challenge here is just because machine learning models are not always very good at shifting distributions, like as we sort of try to adapt our models over time, I think we need to build in policies for quality control and try to maybe even bring in some of the perspectives from like control theory or like different ways to think about the decisions we make and how to understand and measure uncertainty over time as these systems are changing. Just because I think there's a ton of potential, but I also think there's potentially a lot of risks if you let these models sort of train themselves and then potentially just train themselves away from ever predicting anything rare.
Just last second question. Do you think I'm trying to follow up with your reasoning. Do you think we should be open to accept some form of overfitting?
Sorry, say it again.
Do you think we should be open as machine learning experts to be open to some form of overfitting you were talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, it's a bit contentious, right? But I think that often when we talk about distribution shift or like models that are kind of robust to domain shift, we almost are trying to build models that are like completely unable to kind of overfit. There's this classic example of like cows in the grass versus cows on a beach, where like we're bad at predicting cows on a beach. Okay, but most of the time cows are in the grass. And so that actually is a complementary and useful signal, right? It's just a matter of this trade-off between making use of these like non-spurious correlations, but then also being able to recognize when things are out of distribution, when things are not sort of following maybe the standard. And I think that that's really this like fundamental dichotomy, because it's actually quite helpful if there's a big grass field and you have kind of this large cow looking thing, it's most likely to be a cow, right? But you just don't want to lose your ability to predict that cow on a beach.
I would really love to continue this conversation also because you received a lot of questions that are left unanswered, but you already kept talking for more than 15 minutes during the Q&A session. I don't want to overuse your kind availability. So, Sarah, many thanks for your great tech talk. It was, I think, well perceived. I encourage you, in connection with Olga, to get the other questions that are left unanswered and follow up, because lots of questions are, as you understand, a huge sign of interest about the topic you exposed into this community, which is very much concerned about and interested on tiny processing, tiny machine learning. So thanks a lot for your time, for the dedication you put to be available with us today, and very grateful for that. Appreciate it. And allow me to continue to the end of the session, sharing my screen.
And then I did want to say, Olga had mentioned that there's this possibility to follow up on the TinyML forum with additional questions. So I'll be sure to take a look there. And if anyone wants to sort of re-answer any questions we missed, I'll try to address them there.
That's fantastic. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Sarah. So once again, we are driving to the end session of this fantastic TinyML talk with Sarah. And I would like to thank again the strategic partners of TinyML, because they are at the roots of the community and they are very committed to keep alive and to help us in doing what we are doing, like today. And there are different strategic partners, starting from the executive profile, Edge Impulse, which is well known by the community, Qualcomm AI Research, Syntiant, and then there are the platinum strategic partners, DeepLight, Clicatech, Renesas, Sony Semiconductor, and then there are the gold strategic partners, Analog Devices, ARM, PhotoHub, Microsoft, NXP, SensiML, ST Microelectronics, Synaptics, and all the silver strategic partners, Arduino, AIZ, Analog Devices, Dreamwave Technologies, Grover T, IBM, ImageBob, Itemis, Note AI, OctaML, Prophecy, Pixel, Rixen, SAP, Schneider Electric, Silicon Labs, Stream Analyze, TDK Investments. So notice the copyright for today is this multimedia file is copyrighted by the TinyML Foundation. The content, as we said in the slide, will be soon available tomorrow in the TinyML channel. Thanks again for your great availability today to follow up with Sarah Biri presentation, which I am grateful for her time and to be together with us and to answer a lot of questions. And see you next time. Bye.